Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Thank you, Mr. Race Hobbs, for that always mellifluous introduction. And yes, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth on KUNX Digital Broadcasting, heart of the Midwest. Well, I'm up in the increasingly chilly Northeast. Sometimes in the course of conversation, it will come up about with whoever the guest is and whatever the subject, people holding opinions. And I will sometimes say, or on other shows as the interviewee, relative to a certain case or individual, that I don't really have an opinion. And I will usually get called on that very quickly. And what I mean to say is I don't have an informed opinion because I don't feel I know enough about that particular subject or individual yet to do that. Now, in America, everybody is entitled to their opinion. And if it's a completely uninformed one, God bless you, you're allowed to have it anyway. But it's not worth as much as an informed opinion. And there are subjects within the world of UFO studies that I'm still trying to wrap my head around and find out for myself the best evidence, the varying views. And tonight's guest really, his subject embodies some of that. Fascinating subjects and ones that I do want to know more about and better be able to reach my own opinions. Paul Blake Smith was born and raised in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, that's different, Missouri, where in April 1941, his grandfather was a judge and his father went to school there. Paul was a four-year mass communications major and English minor at Southeast Missouri State University. He has written 6 published books, including his most recent bestseller, President Eisenhower's Close Encounters. He has done numerous radio, podcast, television documentary interviews, and his newest book is released by foundationbooks.net. And Paul Blake Smith, it is a pleasure to have you as my guest on tonight's show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everybody watching at home. We got some exciting stuff to talk about tonight, don't we?
I hope so. Paul, as you know, I often begin shows at the beginning. And in this case, where were you born and where exactly did you grow up?
I was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, a long time ago, and was raised there. It's a city of about 40,000 people. Back in 1941, it was about 20,000 people. It was a college town, and I went to college there in the communications department. I just found this out a few years ago, and it makes sense. I'm sure I saw him. One of my college classmates was a burly African-American gentleman named Ced from St. Louis, Missouri, and we know him better today as Cedric the Entertainer. He was also in the communications department. And I looked it up online, and by golly, he was there at the same time I was. I remember seeing him, but I didn't actually have a conversation, honestly. And so I lived there for about 35 years and then moved across the state. But I still occasionally go back to Cape Girardeau and was there this summer. Still a nice town, and I like where I am. But I've been able to research the Cape Girardeau 1941 UFO crash and some other subjects that came up. All 3 of my favorite subjects, like on Eisenhower and on Nixon and on the Cape Girardeau crash, there'd never been a book published. And I kept waiting and waiting. And I thought, well, I'm a writer. I'll look it up. I'll do the research and I'll write the book. So I'm glad that I did. And I've gotten some very nice reviews. And My agent is working on trying to get a Hollywood deal of some sort. So we might see more of this, hopefully.
Good luck on that.
Yeah.
Paul, what did your dad do? And did your mom work, or was she a traditional mom?
My grandfather was the city attorney of Cape Girardeau in 3 different stints and in private practice for about 50 years or more. My dad was his paralegal assistant. My mom was an educator, a school teacher. And I went to classes long ago that had nothing to do with the paranormal. And I would leave, like at SEMO, my college, Southeast Missouri State University, go sit in my car and read paranormal books. I thought this is a lot more interesting than these textbooks I'm supposed to be studying.
Paul, when you started reading as a kid,
Yeah.
did you veer toward the paranormal subject, or were your interest varied, or what did you kind of think you would end up doing as an adult when you were in elementary school?
I pictured myself maybe like in television broadcasting, like in the news, in journalism. And that was my major. I took a lot of that in high school, news writing and the history of journalism and editing and such. And then I took plenty of that when I was in college. So it all came in handy when you became a book author and you had to stop and research things and interview people. The problem for me was all of my stories that I write about are like 50, 70, 80 years ago, and everyone's deceased. So that makes it very tough. And in many cases, their children are deceased. So there were a lot of frustrating dead ends to do these kinds of books.
Let me ask you this. What was it? It could have been something intellectual or something you read, or an experience you had, or something you saw in a movie or on television. What first piqued your interest in the paranormal, UFO-related subjects and mysteries in history?
Today is John Lennon's 83rd birthday. His murder in December of 1980 really started me as a teenager to start thinking about, why are we here? Where are we going? What's your life all about? It could be cut short at any time. Is there an afterlife? And that started my interest in paranormal books and reading the Ruth Montgomery series of books. I don't know if your younger viewers are familiar with that. And I began corresponding with Ruth. And now I have a new book all finished that will be about her life and her prophecies and how they're coming true. And it's kind of scary. I hope a lot of them don't, the ones that are unfulfilled. But I really enjoyed that subject matter more than my scholastic work. It just seems so dull comparatively. And here I am.
Paul, a lot of people are not familiar, as you know, with Ruth Montgomery. Ruth Montgomery was an American psychic who really, in so many ways, was up there with Edgar Cayce in terms of viable proof and very careful record keeping and validations from clients. So it's great that you have had a chance to make contact with her when she's with us and that you've written this book.
She passed away in 2001, just a couple of months short of 9/11. She was getting pretty on in years. And in her last few years, she had macular degeneration, so she could not read my letters. But in the late 80s and all of the 90s, we exchanged correspondences. I still have some of them as proof. And she was a nice lady. She was, to not get too sidetracked on this subject, but we have to remember she was a serious journalist who wrote for the Hearst newspaper chain.
That's right.
And had a column and was on Meet the Press as one of the journalists, and almost on a regular basis, and had nothing to do with psychic matters until she decided to do a story researching some seances at a kind of spiritualist community in Florida. And it got a huge response. And so her newspaper editors encouraged her to do more, of like life after death, ghost stories. And she began to accumulate so many stories from people in Washington, D.C., famous stories or famous people of famous figures. And she began producing books and writing through what we call automatic writing, letting higher spirits, her spirit guides, write through her or type through her at a typewriter. And the messages were so inspiring and uplifting and exciting and intriguing that she wrote a series of books. And her last one came out in '99. And I think it's very worthwhile to go back and research what she was saying and what her spirit guide said about our future. But that's for another time, maybe next year. We've got at least 3 other subjects we can talk about tonight.
Yes, and I want to begin almost chronologically with material that revolves around former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. As part of coming up through the ranks in the world of UFO studies, sooner or later you'll hear about the alleged battle involving American troops and aliens allegedly in an underground complex. And again, based on what you put forward as your threshold for, if not proof, acceptable, viable evidence that something has happened. You and I know, and other researchers and investigators, really all of us do, in one way or another, the difference between, in so many words, saying something is, I believe this is the case, I have come to the conclusion that this is the truth, my research has led me to these conclusions, it is my earnest findings that, as opposed to this is, the I believe this is, I'm convinced this is, I'm sure this is, versus this is. In other words, my opinion versus a general attitude. And a lot of controversy continues to swirl around allegations that President Eisenhower at some point, not that long into his career as president, interfaced with non-human intelligences. It's either the truth or a legend or a combination of truth and confabulation or some permutation in between. But you have become a highly focused specialist in this area. Like you, I'm really interested in post-war history. And of course, it buttresses up and is the context for so much of the world of UFO studies. Literally, the Cold War and our modern age of UFOs begin in the same moment, in the summer of 1947. And my personal curiosity, first question, is what was it that drew you to this particular story out of all of the stories in the world of UFO studies that you could take on and start to do an in-depth look at?
Right. When I was younger, there was an article or two on Eisenhower went to this airbase, and that even J. Allen Hynek looked into the story and was familiar with it. I don't believe it was connected in any way with a battle. I think that was the alleged about Dulce, New Mexico. This was President Eisenhower flying 2,700 miles from Washington to Palm Springs, California, where he supposedly took a golf vacation, even though he golfed most of the time in Augusta, Florida, just down the coast from Washington. He went way out of his way to golf in the desert after he'd just come back from a hunting vacation. And one night he is alleged to have ducked out and gone to Edwards Air Force Base, where he met some landed friendly human-like beings. There wasn't any battle. I don't know of any battle business.
Yeah, I was referring to Dulce. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a great belief in that. I'll admit I haven't researched it a lot, but that's not a subject I'm completely familiar with. But anyway, the story that I saw when I was younger was intriguing. And while I was researching the Cape Girardeau story, I stumbled upon it again and thought, where is there a book about this? And I thought, well, since no one has researched it and written it, I will. And I tried to put all this circumstantial evidence and these serious allegations and leave out some of the junk, some of the like paranoid fantasies that you start to stumble upon in some people's websites or like a pulp magazine or something like this. And what really happened and what was reported at the time, like broadcaster Frank Edwards talked about it. He said, I heard this story that happened this spring. And shortly after he reported that on the MBS radio network, he was fired. And so we can say that may have had a direct correlation. You never know. There could have been another excuse. But it also came out in a magazine in October 54 that these stories about Eisenhower from people at Edwards Air Force Base told us the story is true. He came out to look at things that were not from this world.
Paul, do you remember offhand the magazine that was?
That was Valor magazine of October 1954.
Okay.
I think it's kind of like a macho stories of like armed forces and detectives and adventure and such.
Yeah. You do something that I admire, that I try to do, and there's parallels in my work around the life and death of James Forrestal, our first Secretary of Defense. The internet and so many other less than serious sources claim any number of things about our first Secretary of Defense, leading up into his murder or suicide, depending on what you take as fact. And I was really careful to work from what I consider just established, credible sources, dozens of them. Out-of-print memoirs were a favorite of mine, of people that knew the individual, major news coverage that had stood the test of time, declassified documents and the like, and completely ignoring material that might well be true, sensational as it is, except that there was no way that I had anything to back it up. So better to have maybe a less exotic story, but one that you could really stand behind and say, this is the way it is. How did you begin to really research the story once you had made the decision to take on a book-length project, and at the same time to not go for all of the, most sensationalistic kind of sources out there?
Thank God, or your lucky stars, there's such a thing as a Google search engine. You can look up old newspapers, magazines. You can go to your local library, as I often do. I've got some of my own book collection. I go to book sales. I collect stories and books and paperbacks and anything that might have a scrap of information. Yeah. You just kind of put it all together. I don't think there's any one major one. What intrigued me was a story that came out in the 1982 National Enquirer. And yes, the Enquirer has somewhat of a bad reputation.
But in terms of UFO coverage, especially back then, it was a lot better than a lot of us imagined at the time.
Right. This is what attracted Jackie Gleason, because he was fascinated with this subject, and no one else would cover it in any serious way. And the Enquirer was even offering, some money for any hardcore type of story that had some proof to it. They assembled an all-star panel of experts, including J. Allen Hynek, to assess stories, and they took it seriously. And I think that appealed to a lot of people back then. And they ran the Eisenhower story in '82 as, according to an alleged eyewitness, a test pilot who said he was there and that he finally was speaking up because he didn't want the story to die out. He said, everyone else at the meeting now is dead, and I don't want this story to die. So he told what happened. He said he was called in for his aerodynamic expertise. He was a test pilot and knew all about flight technology and such. And he told quite an interesting story, and it made not only the Enquirer, but it was picked up and syndicated in other newspapers around the world, including the Toronto Star. And I began to read about such things, and I found it intriguing, but I wanted more, and I wanted hard facts, not some silly, wild thing. For instance, American Horror Story on TV took the Eisenhower story within the last year or two and just ran wild and had blood spurting out and aliens killing humans and aliens having sexual relations with humans, and just awful, nasty lies that they concocted around it. And as you have pointed out, there's an entire now independent film called The 11th Green by director Christopher Munch. He did a very fine job, and that was coincidence to my book. When it came out about the same time as my book, we didn't know about each other, and this was a surprise to both of us. So I highly recommend that folks watch that.
I do want to talk a bit about Chris's film later. I thought it was a very special film in a number of respects. But let's talk about Eisenhower first for a bit. A lot of people listening and watching are interested and do read history. Many do not. And Eisenhower, for geeks like us, was a particularly interesting president. He was, of course, had all of the glorious credentials, of classic 19th century politicians, although his was well earned. He was a decent man. He, of course, had been the head of the American, the Allied forces in Europe during the war, was from all accounts a very fine general and a very decent one. He was kind of drafted for the nomination in 1952 and won, of course. I think you'll agree that he was probably the last American president who had, at least close to, the full support and respect of both our military and intelligence communities. And being the president who inherited everything that the Truman administration had accumulated, whether he wanted to or not, he knew everything there was to know about the situation, beginning with the fact that we are not alone. We are being visited by other intelligences from parts unknown and advanced technology for reasons we can only guess, as often as they want it. For you, can you give us an idea of, again, for me, I stress the fact that Eisenhower, for me, was a man of character. And he was in not just a respectful and a respectable position historically when he assumed the presidency, he was also in probably a particularly strong and, I'm guessing, happy marriage. And that means a lot when you're under the kind of pressure that a president of the United States can be. Where did you begin in your inquiry with this central character? Did you try to get a sense of who he was and how he had become that person, or just sort of charge into the UFO-related material and, learn as you went?
You got to research Eisenhower before you start doing a book about what he may and may not have done. And I found a couple of surprises. One, his mother was a pacifist, took away his toy soldiers and books on war when he was a kid and hid them in the attic. And he was not allowed to talk about war. She didn't want to hear about war. And of all the things he could have become, he became a soldier and volunteered for West Point Cadet. And he was a fine athlete, could have gone almost any route in life. He was very bright. And he became a soldier, I'm sure, much to his mother's chagrin. And that also, in his long career, he never saw a battle. He was so wise about strategy and logistics that they prized him in more of a control and strategy situation, and not sending him out on the battlefield in a sense. He would buck up the troops and get them ready for battle, and then he would go back to his headquarters. He was a brave man. Certainly. And he was popular just by about everyone in this country, really. He won in a landslide in 52 and again in 56. It wasn't even close. Yeah. He was easily the most popular, recognized man in America, probably in the whole world. They respected him in other countries because of the way he held the Allied effort in Europe together. Yeah. And they crushed the Nazi war machine in the 40s. And during that time, Eisenhower had to deal with reports of Foo Fighters, or orbs, lights, discs that were flying in and around American and Allied airplanes. And I remember reading, and made it part of my book, that a British RAF officer told his family that he was a bodyguard for Winston Churchill during the war. And he was standing right nearby when Eisenhower and Churchill started talking about these Foo Fighters, a weird objects that were following and going right in front of American and British airplanes. And he heard Eisenhower, General Eisenhower then, and Winston Churchill say, we've got to keep this kind of hushed up. It would cause great upset in society. We don't want people to stop going to church. That was a huge factor. Eisenhower was a very religious man and had put in God we trust on our money.
That's
and
right.
He was the first U.S. president to even be baptized to reinforce. He was baptized in his first months in office, even though he was already a Christian, to try to set examples for others. So he would be very buttoned down, conservative, and religious. So you can imagine his reaction to meeting even friendly humanoids, human-like aliens from another planet, and them having to say, we'd like to begin an education program for the people of Earth. And he's probably like, right off the bat, I don't think that's a good idea. He didn't want people to lose their faith in government or in religion.
Let's take it back just a little bit to the alleged meeting. Can you give us kind of a schematic of the timing, what you feel that we know about the circumstances, what has come down to us allegedly about the meeting in whatever detail you can? Obviously, not to, pull the rug out from under the enjoyment of reading your book. And Race, if you would you bring up that first image right now? The book cover of Paul's first book there. Actually, go to the second image if you would. And the third.
There you go. There we are.
A very evocative
that
image.
was the book from Foundations, came out in 2020. You can still get it from Amazon.com. But in the book, I talk about President Eisenhower went to Palm Springs, and on February 19th, a Friday night, he'd been in town for 2 days golfing.
1954?
Right. He ducked out at night and did these things, as is alleged, and the presidential records show that he had an open window for this on that Friday night. And according to the test pilot who was there, the aliens had landed at the airbase that afternoon and were met by kind of a welcoming committee that kind of interrogated them, interviewed them, felt that they were friendly and harmless. They apparently offered to come on into our spaceship and we'll show you everything. So they gave the okay, all clear sign to Eisenhower. I believe this was set up in advance. It was not a coincidence that Ike was just golfing there. Ike was so popular, to backtrack just a little bit, he had crowds that would come out when he went to Augusta to try to talk to him, take his picture, touch him. He was the great war hero. And so he had this team of Georgia state troopers that would protect him in the late 40s and early 50s till he became president. And in going through Ike's records that are digitized, I found something quite interesting. They said a contingent of 6 Georgia State Highway troopers flew into Palm Springs special for security detail on February 19th, 1954. And I think that's another little piece of the puzzle, that the test pilot said he was surrounded by this team of about 6 bodyguards who protected him. He didn't touch the aliens that he spoke to, and they kept him protected in case anything went wrong. You never know what's going to happen. And I think it would be extremely strange to have Georgia state troopers come out and help with security all the way out in California, unless something really big was up. And then we get to skip ahead just a little, this story of the dentist. Remember the dentist story that he was out, and I thought for many years that must be it, like so many other researchers who barely looked into this story. Well, it turns out I talked to a woman who knew someone who was there that night. And the woman said that Ike was chewing on a duck leg at a dinner on Saturday night, the 20th, and bit into some buckshot. And the host of the dinner said, "Oh my gosh, Mr. President, we're so sorry. the boys went out and shot these ducks this morning, and they used buckshot, and they brought down the birds, and we thought we got all the buckshot out of the meat. He says, what kind of a sportsman uses buckshot on a duck? And he had cracked off the crown on a tooth and was really hurting. They called a dentist, and the dentist said, oh, yeah, sure. President of the United States needs me right away. And he hung up and went back to what he was doing. And they had to call him back like an hour or two later. Where are you? The president needs you. And he says, seriously? Yeah, Dr. Francis Purcell went to his office, treated Eisenhower, and that's why he was gone for a few hours. The dentist story is actually true. There are some records about this at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, that he had an upper left incisor and a crown installed like a temp crown. So it was the night before that he ducked out, when the press was distracted by a party at the hotel. They were all gathered together. It was a very clever thing to put on. Eisenhower's host in Palm Springs was the man who set up the party and kept the press occupied, entertained, and distracted, so that his buddy Eisenhower could go out and pull off this meeting and come back. And it worked pretty good. Eisenhower came back probably around midnight, and no one was the wiser.
Paul, aside from the aforementioned test pilot's commentary and testimony about this, can you give us a few other examples of what you consider the best evidence to put Eisenhower in this actual position with this non-human intelligence?
Yeah, some of the first inklings on this story came out in a book by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, I think, on the Roswell event. And they said, well, we tracked this story down that Eisenhower went to Palm Springs, and we talked to a member of the Eisenhower cabinet who was still alive and living in Arizona at the time. And he said, oh, that story is actually true. He did go on a secret trip, and he took a helicopter there from like Palm Springs to Edwards Air Force Base, which would have been about 90 miles more or less in the desert by road. So he flew there, and he flew in. And when he was done, he swore everyone to secrecy, said, you're not to speak of this ever again, according to the test pilot. But there are little pieces here and there. For instance, I think it was a sergeant in the Air Force said, I was at the airbase that day, and we were at artillery practice out in this big open field in the desert. And the general was there ordering us to open fire on these targets in the desert. And we looked up, and here come these 5 spacecraft, obviously from another world. 3 were circular and 2 were elongated. And he said, the general said, those are bogeys that are not supposed to be here, violating our airspace. Open fire on those. And they said they did. They turned their guns on the craft coming in, quite silver and shiny and noiseless and harmless. And they said we fired on them, and our artillery had no effect whatsoever. They just floated right on down to a runway on the airbase and landed. So he told that to investigator Gabriel Green a long time ago, like back in the 50s. And that was another story that put it together. Frank Scully, another reporter, put together some more information, said that he spoke to a man near Palm Springs who said he was working, I think as a plumber who was called into the base and was working that day. And that he said, the plumber said, Eisenhower came to visit. This should have been a huge story. I can't understand why this was covered up. So again and again and again, there's little bits and pieces, nothing hugely dramatic, because it was hushed up and people were sworn to secrecy. But we can put it together. Also, that magazine article interviewed actual people at the base who said when this happened, those who were out on leave that particular weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, came back to the base and were met at the gate and told them, here's your stuff, your belongings, go get lost for a few days. So they weren't even allowed back in. And that's how unusual things were at Edwards during that weekend in mid-February of 1954. So when you add it all together, it's compelling.
Yeah, it is. Having developed some very compelling insights into Eisenhower, the man, and the president, combined with whatever you feel is the best evidence, if there is any evidence, to give us an idea of what this exchange was about, or if the president confided to anyone the substance of what had passed between him and this being.
I think Eisenhower took his own oath of secrecy quite seriously. I don't think he told his wife or his son. His son was interviewed not long before he passed away and said he did not know about it. He didn't think it happened. And that's okay if his father didn't tell him. Can you reword the question?
Yeah. Do we have anything substantial to give us an idea or our best educated guess on what the substance of the exchange was between the president and this being?
Yeah. Why would aliens possibly land and ask to speak to the man in charge, or even set this up in advance, supposedly through binary code and high frequency radio communication? Well, according to the test pilot, the aliens expressed great concern over Eisenhower's approval and carrying out his atomic bomb testing program.
Yeah.
We were like our scientists were like children playing with matches and gasoline nearly. We were setting off atomic bombs in the land, in the sea, in the air, and polluting with contaminants even into the upper atmosphere. And I think that's a pretty good excuse for aliens, or a reason to risk, being shot at. Apparently they were, to land and to speak to Eisenhower and beg him, will you stop with the nuclear weapons? And he allegedly told him, well, I'd like to, but I'm not going to disarm unilaterally. So they, according to one source, the aliens may have dangled a bit of a little incentive in front of him, a clean energy system. And he also turned that down, feeling that it would dramatically change the American way of life. And he didn't want the stock market jolted. He didn't want an economic collapse from a revolutionary change. Yeah. And remember, again, Eisenhower was very conservative, didn't like to rock the boat. And he was old enough to remember the stock market crash of 1929, didn't want something like that happening on his watch, in which the American economy collapsed and it went down in a domino effect for the rest of the world. And no one wanted another Great Depression. So he was not receptive to their ideas. They asked if they could start an education program for the people of Earth to let them know they're not alone and that there are people visiting here from other worlds. And he didn't like that idea either. He said, essentially, our world's just not ready for you.
Paul, this is, I guess, a question that speaks to critical thinking, common sense, deductive reasoning, and lots of study, which you've done. Having some sense of Eisenhower's public behavior in terms of policy making, in terms of being the leader of the Republican Party, more like the Democratic Party these days, how things change in terms of their platforms at the time. But is there kind of has anybody put forward observations about some change in his behavior or views or opinions or philosophy with that BC-AD Mark being, that visit to Edwards Air Force Base? Or pretty much, he went on being President Eisenhower in the public sense in an unchanged manner after this alleged contact?
Yeah, I think he did not change that much. He was stubbornly conservative, but he continued programs that Roosevelt and Truman set up for, like Social Security, and he felt those were important to continue to help Americans. It's unfortunate, but it is worth mentioning someone within his cabinet promoted a program called Operation Wetback, in which they were going to round up illegal aliens that were not, American born and kick them out of the country. That's how conservative and not friendly towards people coming into America who are human beings. So you can see how he wouldn't adapt too well of humanoid types, even though they apparently looked a good deal like us, according to the test pilot, who said they were kind of human, but somewhat misshapen by our human standards. So, yeah, he said that they looked a good deal like us. And in the time since I wrote the book, I've been encountering a number of stories that scientists and cosmologists today feel two things. Very, very likely that there are other planet Earths in the cosmos, and it developed human life. And there are other forms of human beings who might be a little like us, or maybe larger chests for breathing a different atmosphere, wider nostrils or something, that we could call them cousins of human beings. And that sounds like what landed at Edwards Air Force Base, that they were a good deal like us. So it kind of hangs together again, even though it's a pretty wild story that on the surface you think, oh, this couldn't, well, and then you start reading and start hearing all of this. Well, maybe it did. I think that it really did happen. After my book came out, I was contacted by a guy who's got far better contacts than I do. And he said, I asked those contacts and they said, yes, this guy's book is true. Eisenhower did meet with him. And one person who was there was the Air Force Colonel Twining, Nathan Twining, who was then promoted later to, I think, Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I think he was already a brigadier, but he actually went on to become head of Joint Chiefs.
So that would have been a natural for him, the head of the Air Force, also, and armed forces would have been there for protection and safety, because you never know. I'm sure Eisenhower was familiar with stuff like the Romans and their Trojan horse. Oh, yes. What looks like something friendly, and you let them in, and then suddenly all is chaos. So he had to make sure, that these were really genuinely friendly beings.
Yeah. And he certainly was a student of history, and of course, a great student of the history of conflict. Well, I haven't read your book yet, but I do look forward to it. A film came out several years ago by a director, producer, and writer, and a particularly good one, an independent in Hollywood, named Christopher Munch, spelled like M-U-N-C-H. And I found it an extremely thoughtful film that is based on the exact premise that you've given us in terms of the actual time frame. And the what if aspect is a investigative writer who is a real muckraker and works for a station in Washington, D.C., learns that his father has died. And his father, who he was estranged from, is very high up in Air Force intelligence, and he has to go out there to Palm Springs to settle his estate. One thing leads to another, and he learns things. Again, The 11th Green, I think it's available on Amazon, but another thoughtful look at this subject, which Paul has explored so much in this sense. Do you feel that, and there's no way to know this, of course, it's more just that you have focused in on this, that point of transition where Eisenhower kind of passed the reins of power to President-elect Kennedy, do you feel that this subject probably didn't come up, and that Eisenhower knew it would be either taken up or not taken up by the intelligence community that was putting representatives together to meet with the new president, or that he may have shared something about this with the president to follow him? It's again.
Yeah. I was surprised that an old Navy man like JFK and an old Army man like Eisenhower met at Camp David after they met twice before JFK took office. They exchanged letters. They exchanged phone calls. You can hear some of them on the internet. And then Kennedy would fly out 3 different times to California and met with Eisenhower at the 11th Green home in Palm Springs for closed door meetings. Something was up very important that they could not send assistants, intermediaries back and forth. They couldn't put it in letter form, or they didn't feel trustworthy of the phone system. They had to meet in private, and there were some photographs taken by the press before they met. And, they posed around Eisenhower's pool in the backyard on the 11th green, which is why Christopher Mensch gave his film that name.
Yeah.
And so I think they knew they were communicating probably on this issue. I'm sure that a good deal of their meeting and speaking like this was about the Vietnam War, which was going on. And you just don't give out strategy on phone lines that could be tapped, or put things on paper that could be leaked or something. But I'll wager that they could have had continuing discussions on this event, and how possibly a treaty was formed between Eisenhower and the race that visited. He allegedly asked this humanoid type race, please don't openly show yourself, don't set down at major cities, don't start a panic, please don't do this, and we'll agree to give you supposedly kind of a private base in Arizona, according to some 1989 Defense Intelligence Agency documents that leaked a few years ago. So again, that document says Eisenhower really did meet with him, and on 2 other occasions. And so I looked those occasions up, cross-referencing with Eisenhower's printed schedule, and it looks like it's a possibility that he could have gotten away to done these communications in person. If you've ever read the works of Art Campbell, the late UFO researcher, he asserts that he found out through his research Eisenhower did go to an Air Force base and was seen there, and that he met with some extraterrestrials. One ship came down and hovered in the middle of the air. The other landed on a runway in 55, 1 year later. And that afterwards, Eisenhower went into the base and gathered everyone into a kind of theater and swore them to secrecy, let them know that this is not to be discussed. So there's that. To backtrack just a bit, you mentioned the 11th Green film, which we both highly recommend people watch. Christopher Mensch picked up on something that I did too. There's a story that there were 2 cameramen working film and recording the event as it happened. And there's film footage to this day that some people allege to have seen, color and black and white. One of the set of films stops abruptly because the alien technology at the summit meeting, as I call it, on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base, clashed with our film technology and knocked out the camera. And even that, if true, would have caused Eisenhower great concern, because, if they can buzz around here and accidentally knock out one of our cameras, what are they going to do to an entire city or to our military operations or something like that? Another reason why he told them, you're going to have to go, don't come around here too often. So Christopher Mensch made sure to put this into his movie. And you see, even in the artwork, cameramen running like a newsreel camera or film camera to record from within the hangar this historic event. Christopher Barbato is a reporter in Italy, and he covered the Vatican. And he said this is something that he uncovered, that the Vatican is aware that they've seen the film footage. It was secreted to the Pope at the time, who was keenly interested. And so that Barbato's sources in the Vatican confirm that there's this film footage. I sure wish it could get leaked or hacked so we could see it.
Yes, we can say that about quite a number of films.
That's right. Yeah.
Allegedly exist in places that are not accessible to us. Did you come away from this compelling project? I mean, these things can take months or several years to pull together.
Oh, I sure did.
Yeah. Did you come away with a different feeling about this president than when you went in? And if so, what changed in your perception or your thoughts about President Eisenhower?
I think there's a public notion that set in over the years that Ike was almost a lazy, disconnected golf-playing figurehead. the Democrat Party started a joke in the mid-50s. They said, let's run Ben Hogan for president. If we're going to have a golfer all the time in the White House, we might as well make it a good one. But that's the image that Eisenhower had. He would chip golf balls on the White House lawn. And I found out later, he did this strategically. He wanted to let Russians and other people know, people who were watching our every move, that all is well, all is calm. And he would do this during a kind of crisis to project an image of calm. But more and more, I read that he was really involved in intelligence and strategies around the world, that he was more hands-on than we thought. We all thought he was like a grandfatherly figure who didn't get involved in much, and just the opposite. He was a highly intelligent man, used to army strategy, military strategy, and that he was a good and decent man, as you pointed out, and that he was respected by everyone, and gave that famous speech when he left office talking about the military
industrial complex.
Yeah.
You know, Paul, I couldn't agree with you more. He was all those things, as you note, and at the same time, knowing that there was no way to know how the world would react. It's one thing to stand here in the present and yell back at all these dead white guys, why didn't you act differently? It's another thing to try to put ourselves even remotely in their position and appreciate the true fear of the unknown they were dealing with in terms of the future of, for starters, the Western world, so to say, and every socioeconomic Judeo-Christian possible permutation of events that could lead things out of control. And this was, of course, the beginning, the true beginning of our national security state. I think some folks feel that when things kicked in 47, that it began with that irritant, that initial irritant being, and I say irritant because I often compare that beginning of the national security state to a piece of sand that gets into an oyster, and the oyster starts to build up a calcification around it to not be irritated by the rough edges of that little piece of sand, and that becomes a pearl. But at the beginning of that particular pearl, the pearl that became our national security state, is not fear of the Russians getting our nuclear secrets. It was fear of this information getting out and causing who knows what possibilities in destabilization. We only have about 3 minutes left before we go to break, and I want to hold the material that we're going to be going on to, primarily Nixon-Gleason story, for our next half of the show. But any thoughts in closing off the considerations about this alleged meeting, which of course would have been paradigm shifting and is something I think, if it existed, the American people have a right to know about, and at the same time, good luck on that at the speed things are going.
Yes, one factor we have to keep in mind all the time when reviewing any story, Roswell, Cape Girardeau, Eisenhower, Nixon, was the 1938 pre-Halloween War of the Worlds broadcast, in which some people did panic. I think that was a little overblown, but it gave the impression that Americans would flee into the streets with guns or have heart attacks at home listening to a fictional radio play, being easily fooled. So that had to have been a huge factor for men like Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and so forth. They remembered this, and they don't want to start something like that again. So it's another reason to keep the lid clamped on tight till we investigate and scientifically explore this, and let the men in charge handle this. You know, the government will make sure it's protecting the people. And it was a patriotic maybe thing to do back then. So times have changed, but we haven't had enough revelations from our government. Maybe we'll get more. I'm not too optimistic, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Have you received any responses about the book from readers that really caught you off guard in that they may have been particularly knowledgeable about the subject, or added something to the mix that you had been unaware of?
I told you about this contact of mine who has other contacts. He said he found out from his contacts that President Hoover was also at the first initial meetings of contact to interview these people, welcome them to Earth, and then give the okay sign to President Eisenhower. And when you find out about Hoover, he was very close to Eisenhower. They were both very conservative, and Hoover was largely from California and would have been a natural for Eisenhower to have trusted and gone to the base. I did not get that into my book. I don't know if it's absolutely true, but it certainly makes sense that you would have an all-star type panel to interview these people once they first arrived, to make sure, absolutely sure, these people are harmless and friendly. As I put in my book, Harry Truman was seen in Palm Springs around this time, that's a quote from the mayor of Palm Springs in his autobiography. I have it up on a shelf there. That I don't know around this time, if that was the exact time of the Eisenhower, but that would be another strong indication that of all the places on Earth, Hoover maybe was around and Truman just happened to show up, and there's Eisenhower. If all of this is true, or even one or two or three, something major was up, and we can't ignore this.
Well, whatever happened back then, you and I, are about to go to break. This is Peter Robbins with my guest, Paul Blake Smith. The program is Meanwhile Here on Earth, and we will be back in 4.
It's almost here, ladies and gentlemen. The UNX Network Year 2 anniversary at XCon 2023. XCon is being held this year from October the 30th to November 1st at the beautiful Oasis Hotel and Conference Center in Springfield, Missouri. Top speakers include host of America Unearthed, Scott Walter, plus Haley Ramsey, Sev Tak, UNX's very own Maureen Richmond and Dan Terry, Mindy Toutfest, Harriet McFeely, Forrest Crawford, and many more. And they're all coming to deliver new information on topics like UFOs, alien encounters, cryptids and ancient secrets, and real hauntings from the afterlife. Join us for the film premiere of A Haunting in Blue Hill. And don't miss the Mad Hatter Paranormal Halloween Bash, Banquet, and Costume Contest on All Hallows Eve, October 31st. So join us as we close out the 2023 conference season. Info and tickets are available now at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com, and we'll see you there.
And welcome back. Meanwhile, here on Earth, your host, Peter Robbins, and my guest, Paul Blake Smith. Race, could you bring up the cover of the Nixon-Gleason book? And thank you. That's a great cover as well, I might add. Very evocative. This case, Paul, I feel considerably less contentious about as a longtime student of Richard Nixon's, in terms of what a unique character he was, to put it mildly, in American politics,
Yeah.
who, reviled as he was by many of us at certain times in his administration, he was a brilliant strategist and certainly a knowledgeable man who was full of contradictions. And we will, of course, be talking about him over this hour, but lesser known to most people is the other person in this story, Jackie Gleason, who most Americans just think of, and thanks, Race, appreciate the cover there, who most Americans think of mostly only associated with old reruns, what other kinds are there, of The Honeymooners, the classic American 1950s comedy, which some of us are old enough to have grown up with and still enjoy occasionally watching. Gleason was not just some comic. Jackie Gleason was born in Brooklyn, very modest means, went to work very young. I think his mother, who he was devoted to, died when he was about 16. He had a hard life to a degree and worked to make a name for himself in the entertainment business. I think he entered essentially in vaudeville. And as television came into its own, he had this opportunity to create this, what came to be known as a situation comedy. And, you know, I think most of us who have some sense of an appreciation for the evolution of American television comedy, it's really right up there with I Love Lucy. It's as classic as they get. And it gave him a national profile that bloomed into starring in Broadway plays, in being one of the most influential and powerful and successful entertainers of his generation. And for folks who only think of him in a comedic way, he was a powerhouse of an actor. His serious work on film stands up to this moment like crazy. The Hustler and other films that he appeared in were extraordinarily powerful films. How did this odd couple kind of come together in a way? And I know you'll go into that with a lot more detail than I can, but from my studies, we have Richard M. Nixon, who is not a man who has a tremendous warmth that he's known to radiate. He certainly has his friends, but you know, he's fairly tightly wound. And here is Gleason, who in a way may be living his ultimate fantasy, or at least in part. He is a womanizer of the first order, loves his wife, and a marriage that, you know, really stood the test of time. At the same time, he was a drinker. He was a brilliant pool player. And Nixon fancied himself quite a good billiard player, and he was. There was a table at the White House, I'm sure there still is, that he used to use regularly. I think they both found each other fascinating as different kinds of people. And you can give us an idea of how their friendship began, but that these two seemingly opposite men, both with a knowledge of and interest in the UFO subject, Gleason's especially pronounced, and his scholarship on the subject and the size of his library on the subject, parts of his private life that most folks don't know about, of course, were legend. But with that as a bit of a preamble, can you lay the groundwork for us for how these two very different men met and their cordial acquaintanceship became a real friendship, and one ultimately that seems to have borne a secret that was not kept completely secret?
Yeah. To backtrack slightly, President Eisenhower had a National Security Council member, a close advisor named Everett Gleason, who I found was born in Brooklyn, New York, and raised there just a few years before Jackie. When Eisenhower went to Palm Springs, he met with his National Security Council, and he met with them again as soon as he got back. And Everett Gleason was part of that. Jackie had some sort of obsession with UFOs, and he began in the weeks and months after the Eisenhower encounter to build his own UFO house. He wanted to feel like he was living in a UFO. Yeah. And it was this big round house with big glass bay windows.
Right on the water.
Yeah. And just outside New York City, kind of set near the edge of a cliff so you could look out and feel like you're flying in a flying saucer. What caused Jackie to be so obsessed and spend like $1 million on this custom built house? Which, here's another strange aspect of the house. It had to be largely put together in an airport or an airfield hangar and brought to the site and then slipped into place. And it took like 5 years. And when it was finished, one of Jackie's first guests was Richard Nixon, the vice president, in 1959. So I think Jackie must have met Eisenhower and Nixon in the 1950s. He was a conservative and a supporter of conservative values. But Jackie was also obsessed with golf. So in 1964, he decided, I've vacationed in Miami so often, I'm going to move my whole show, the Jackie Gleason variety program, to Miami. And he sold his UFO house to CBS and moved lock, stock, and barrel all the way to Miami, where he bought a house in a golf course community. And so he would golf in the 1960s with Nixon, who had very little else to do. He lost the race for the presidency in 1960. He lost the race for the California governorship in 1962. And he was an attorney who was back and forth between New York City and Key Biscayne, Florida. So the two naturally became conservative golf buddies. They both perspired excessively. They both drank a little too much. They both loved talking about the whys and wherefores of life when they were together. And I'm sure Jackie badgered Nixon all the time. What have we got? I want to hear more. And Nixon apparently was pretty tight-lipped. So that they formed a friendship just from hitting the links. And you can see photographs of the two of them together. It may not seem so unusual. They were both married with 2 daughters. And they really had a hankering, at least Gleason did, for why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? He wanted the answers. Jackie had to be the best and know the most in everything. He was the best in show business. He did it all, singing and dancing and comedy and pantomime. And he did dramatic movies, as you point out. And he did stage plays. He did stand-up comedy, slapstick sketches. He mastered everything. So he wanted to be the master of the paranormal and had a book collection of over 1,700 books, which was extraordinary for its time. Yeah. And he kept them all in his personal library in Miami. And he would read alone a lot. Both he and Nixon had insomnia. So there was another thing they had in common. They liked to golf together and talk. And so they became pretty, not fairly close friends. I don't think anyone got too close to Nixon except Bebe Rebozo, who also lived in Key Biscayne. So there was another factor for Nixon to spend some time with 2 of his good friends. Now, that's where they got together.
My best understanding is Gleason's initial interest in the subject of UFOs, and first, the UFO-shaped house is definitely some hours drive from New York City. It's more upstate, but it's in a beautiful location, and the impetus, as I understand it, for Nixon for Gleason's obsession with UFOs is that he had an unforgettable sighting himself of a craft either taking off from or diving into a body of water that he witnessed. Do you have any information to that effect?
Yeah. Jackie gave an interview, I think in the early 1970s, and said he finally got to see some UFOs while walking a beach in Miami. And it was out over the ocean. I wish we knew more about that. He gave an interview in the 1950s to TV Guide and said, I've never seen anything. And I'll interrupt the flow of this to say to your viewers, I've never seen a UFO either. I'd like to see one. I don't know what my reaction would be, but it would be most interesting. And I'm sure Jackie felt the same way. And he finally did see one, according to his own story, And Jackie, it's important to point out, was not a fabricator. He didn't tell a bunch of drunken, crazy, tall tales.
Right.
He wanted facts. He
Yes.
would call up UFO authors and quiz them intensely on the subject of their book. And then he would call up the subjects that were in the book, like a UFO sighter, someone who had this alleged encounter, and then quiz them. He had to know every last detail. He was so obsessed in private. And, he was risking his career. If people found out about this, they might have thought, well, this guy's, what is he, nuts?
Yeah.
It was a
Beloved
much
as he was as a comic, the ridicule still applies to comics. It also occurs to me that Gleason, I mean, what you just said for some people might sound so far-fetched. You call up an author, you find out what you can on a subject, then you call the subjects. When you are world famous, you can actually do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And most of us don't think in those terms. I'm going to call this well-known person to find out something from them, and they're going to take my call because I'm Jackie Gleason. And then I'm going to call this person that they've told me about and introduce myself. And if they hesitate, I will, let them know I really am this person. And as a result, my own due diligence is that much more effective. So we come to a point in their relationship, and they are both down in Florida. There are a number of versions of the story of the trip out to the airbase and what they encountered. What is your best guess, based on all of the information that's coming to you, of what actually transpired from the beginning of being in the White House and then not being in the White House on their way, then being someplace else? Take us through this as well as you can, Paul.
Yeah, because it is confusing. There are various angles of people who polluted the story, but I go with what Beverly Gleason said. She wrote, first she gave an interview and mentioned this briefly in 74, a year after the event, and Jackie blew up when it hit the papers.
And Beverly, of course, is his wife, who then was his widow.
Right. They were separated in 74, and Jackie just exploded like, how dare you talk about this? You're never to discuss this. And they divorced. They had been separated. She had been hoping for a reconciliation, and what she revealed, that he told her that Nixon took him to an airbase and showed him. So that made him very upset because he wasn't supposed to talk about it. So in 83, long after their divorce, she decided, I'm going to write a tell-all book. And she wrote an article by herself for the National Enquirer. So again, the Enquirer, but it was written by Beverly. And she said, I'll never forget the night in 73 when my husband came home near midnight. He was ashen-faced and haggard. She said, he looked terrible. And I said, what happened to you? And he said, Nixon just took me to Homestead Air Force Base and showed me the bodies of alien beings at last. And, it shook him up badly. She said he was not just shaken up that day, but rattled for weeks, and that he would get all giddy and excited that Nixon showed me the real hard proof above all other people in this country. I got to see it. And he was just like giddy as a schoolboy. And then his moods would change to just the opposite. He'd become angry. The government's holding on to this. They won't reveal it. I can't talk about it and reveal it, that I've been sworn to secrecy. And it made him furious. He said the government makes people who see UFOs and report them to sound like idiots when they've got the evidence and they're studying it. Yeah. So she said his reaction was so authentic. She believed him. She felt it to be a true story, that he came home just as pale as a ghost, like he'd seen what he'd wanted all his life. He got his dream come true about a week before his birthday in February of 1973, when who showed up at his celebrity golf tournament? Richard Nixon in a helicopter. And that's kind of a key factor to this story.
I think also, and you may have come upon this account as I have over the decades, that Nixon, in passing at some point, realizing, of course, I don't care how much they were drinking before this, but realizing the protocol that he was about to break, if it ever blew back on him, would be a scandal, of course, to put it mildly. And as much as said to Gleason, if you ever allege that this happened, I will deny it. And who will people believe?
Yeah,
the
really.
president of the United States or an alcoholic comedian. Well,
Yeah.
the alcoholic comedian anytime.
Yeah.
But one can just do one's best to try to imagine, right now, for example, part of the scandals revolving around our recent past president is that he shared classified information with people who were not entitled and certainly not credentialed to see it. For Richard M. Nixon to take Jackie Gleason out to this base and allow him to see these things is in violation probably of every national security protocol imaginable. But you make decisions in life, and obviously this one, even to the degree that it got out in our long-running previous age of ridicule, it was hardly more than a blip on the map, except among certain people within the research community who simply made a mental note and went on from there. Do we know from anyone else as credible as Beverly Gleason what exactly Gleason says that he saw there? Or please remind me, it's been years since I read her memoir, but what in particular do we remember her alleging that Gleason said in specific that he saw?
Right.
And
What?
how,
Yeah.
the journey from the surface to where they encountered this material?
She did not say at any time that Nixon dropped by the house and picked him up. He went to a Homestead Air Force Base, and it's very important to know that Nixon arrived at Jackie's golf tournament because they had a helipad at his golf tournament at the golf course right outside Jackie's house. So I'm pretty certain Nixon went about by helicopter a lot in Miami. He did that very day, Monday, February 19th, 1973, the exact 19th anniversary of the Eisenhower encounter, where Eisenhower went to an airbase. So Nixon may well have sent over a chopper, called up Jackie on the phone, and he went out, got in a chopper, and was flown to Homestead Air Force Base. Nixon was there and took him to what was alleged to have been a kind of laboratory or medical examination building. And according to Beverly Gleason, Nixon showed him 4 dead alien bodies, apparently identical, that were laid out on 4 examining tables, as you would like in a morgue for a post, death autopsy or something. He said they looked like maybe they had been embalmed. Said they had big pointy ears, big bug eyes, were only about 2.5 feet tall. They were little dwarfish sized creatures. And if you know anything about the 1955 Hopkinsville, Kentucky invasion, the Sutton family out in the countryside in August of 55 said these little dwarfish aliens were harassing them, and they got out a shotgun and fired at them and didn't seem to hit them. And they described, again, the same exact pointy-eared, big bug-eyed, like 2-foot tall aliens. And that's what Jackie described seeing on these examining tables. So it's fascinating what Jackie told his wife and that she remembered. We're kind of relying on her memory, but she wrote this in 83. And she wrote it out pretty carefully, and that Jackie was serious, and she believed him.
Paul, is there any reason to suspect that Nixon had an ulterior motive in bringing Gleason into this ultimate secret? Do you think that there was some ulterior motive here?
I do. What incentive, what possible reason would Nixon violate national security to show his golfing buddy top secret stuff? And here it is. Nixon was caught in a trap in early 73. His Watergate burglars had been caught and were threatening to talk. And they were asking for at least $1 million for openers, for hush money, for their legal defense and for their families to continue to pay the bills. Jackie had been offering $1 million to anyone who could show him the hard proof of alien beings. He started out early in his career, $50,000, then $100,000, then $500,000. And by the early 70s, it grew to $1 million to anyone who can show me. Well, I think Nixon took him up on that. In the Watergate tapes, President Nixon was in the White House that he self-bugged, and he's heard lamenting about this hush money he's got.
I think we can do that.
Yeah, Nixon said, "Oh, this damn hush money, where are we going to get this?" Shortly after the Nixon-Gleason encounter, Nixon's calm as can be and says, "Yeah, that's no problem. We've got that money. I know where we can get our hands on it to pay these people." So somebody donated a lot of money.
So you feel that it might have been in the form of a, political contribution, or that?
Right.
I see. Well, that's not
also, Nixon and Gleason shared the same lawyer, a man named Herb Kalmbach, who went to jail for distributing large amounts of cash to the Watergate burglars and their families. That was obstruction of justice, and he went to prison for this. So he had the cash, and he had worked previously for Jackie in selling the rights to the Honeymooners reruns, and Nixon used him in various connections and cases that he had. So we can see how 2 and 2 add up to 4. Do I have the hard proof for this? No, I don't. But it doesn't take too much of a scientist to know that Jackie made up to $14 million a year. So to blow $1 million on Nixon, to finally see the hard proof he's been longing for his whole life, it would have been worth it to Jackie to help his friend out.
And $14 million a year in the mid to early 70s was a lot of money. Even
a lot of money, yeah.
I mean, you and I go through that pretty quickly these days, but it was more substantial back then. Paul, is there any reason to suspect that there was a second well-known individual, a celebrity, that also may have been part of this story?
I am suspicious, without proof, that Bob Hope was also taken into Nixon's confidence for a lot of money. Hope was a major contributor. Just before Nixon went to Miami, the records show, he called up Bob Hope to make sure, "You're going to be there, right? You're going to be at Jackie's golf tournament that day on the 19th. And yes, indeed, Bob Hope golfed often with Jackie, and they were golf partners that very day when Nixon sat down in his helicopter to talk to them. And so that afternoon, they were all right there together on that helipad. And Bob Hope went home and seemingly, strangely, designed his own UFO house, which you can see to this day in Palm Springs, California. In the weeks and months after it, he put it together, designed it, funded it, and had it constructed on the edge of a kind of bluff with big bay windows to look out like you're flying in a flying saucer. They call it Bob Hope's Palm Springs UFO house. It's still there. Where did he get this idea, huh?
I was going to say, is there anything on the public record? Because, of course, with many celebrities and other well-known people who have spoken out on the subject, or who have shared the fact that they've had a sighting or take the subject seriously, do we have any information suggesting that Bob Hope was interested in the subject before this? And if so, what is that information?
I couldn't find any hard proof that Bob Hope had any personal interest, I'll admit. He did narrate a movie, I think around 1950-something, that mentioned UFOs, and they called them flying saucers, and they showed images, and Hope was narrating what people saw in 1947, around the time of the Roswell crash. So he was at least familiar with the subject, but he was actually wealthier than Jackie Gleason, was a financial supporter of Nixon. And the two, Nixon and Hope, golfed together all the time out in California. And they were close friends who Bob Hope loved to travel, and he flew to Washington and met with Nixon in the weeks after the golf tournament in February of '73. I tried to listen to the audio, and you could barely make it out. It was very poorly recorded. Nixon should have told him, talking to this lapel that I have or something, but it was not too audible. I would doubt if they would leave something in the Nixon Digital Library where they're talking about, "Hey, do you remember that spaceship we saw?" But it hangs together as logical speculation, I would call it, or circumstantial evidence. But Hope was immensely wealthy. He left behind a huge estate when he passed away, and he was wealthy back then. Right. So I'm suspicious, but I lack the hard proof, I admit.
Paul, do you feel that, how can I say this? Well, let me put it this way. What do you think was the main factor in Nixon's, again, his decision to share this with Jackie Gleason? I just need that reiterated because,
Yeah.
They are strange bedfellows on a certain level, but one can see how these complementary, different types of personalities were drawn to each other over this subject.
I think Nixon was motivated by money, and he may have wanted to bring his golfing buddy kind of more into his world, that at least Nixon knew what was going on.
Mhm.
I have read elsewhere that Homestead has been a site for a collection of otherworldly material, to put it politely, and that Nixon knew that Jackie Gleason's birthday was coming up, like within 7 days or so. Jackie wanted something for his birthday that no one could possibly give him except Nixon. So there's another small factor. Jackie probably also kept badgering him so many times when they were golfing and hanging out together that he finally got fed up and, just give him what he wants. I'll just show him the darn hard proof and then swear him to secrecy. Beverly Gleason said, Jackie told me that he was sworn by Nixon to secrecy before he left the base, not to talk about it, but that she wormed this story out of him when he came home just pale as a ghost. Yeah. And so we have to ask ourselves, would Nixon really do this? And as you have pointed out, he was a quirky individual, highly intelligent. He had access to CIA information. He had just fired the director of the CIA in early February, just before he set up this flight to Jackie Gleason's golf tournament and possibly to Homestead Air Force that night. So Nixon was called King Richard of the Imperial Presidency. He just got whatever he wanted. He did whatever he felt like he was doing.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's another factor, that both Gleason and Nixon had this fame and fortune that they could throw around and get anything done that they wanted, and they apparently did.
Paul, in your investigations and research, and I want to thank you for reminding me and our audience how this whole story is superimposed on the timeline of the entire Watergate scandal. That's very important to take into consideration in look over here, not over here, folks, as a potential. I had understood years ago, and this is well before I became involved in the field, that as the Watergate prosecution was taking shape, and it was more and more obvious at a time where the truth was more important than partisan politics to our elected officials across the board, that if this trial happened, this impeachment trial in the Senate, it was going to be ugly. It was going to be particularly disruptive to our nation's state. It would be humiliating to the office of the presidency. And ultimately, Nixon, in probably certainly one of his finest moments, did the right thing and stepped down rather than drag us through a national crazy period. I had learned some years ago that Nixon was considering actually just taking the lid off this thing and, to one degree or another, just going public with the fact that we had artifacts, that we were not alone, etc., with the maybe desperate thought that doing it at that moment, the nation would galvanize around this shattering news and realize better to stick with, the flawed president that we have than at this moment in time when, we're not alone and all that, that we go on to new leadership, but that he thought the best of it and obviously did not act on that possibility. Have you ever heard anything to that effect?
Just somewhat. You're familiar with the Robert Emenegger film story, where he was approached by some people associated with Nixon. He was an old buddy of H.R. Haldeman. And in early 73, he said, we were approached to, would you like to do a documentary on UFOs? And of course, wow, well, okay. And they were promised some film footage that Nixon's people allegedly wanted to get this out in a professional documentary that would, of course, make Nixon look good as the great revealer of these things.
Yeah.
And they were promised this UFO landing footage from during Nixon's presidency, May of 1971. So I did the research, and it's possible on the date given that Nixon may have handled this affair with Haldeman in the White House, and that's all part of my book. But to get it clear, this film footage of a UFO landing was not allowed to Mr. Emenegger after all, and that the film didn't fall apart, but it was just not what he had hoped, and was released in 74, right after Nixon resigned, and the whole thing did not happen. Supposedly, I think Emenegger was told, well, what, he asked what happened, and they said, we didn't want another revelation that we've been hiding more and more secrets from the American public. Enough has gotten out that makes Nixon look bad. So they decided to just keep the lid on, and Ford and Carter kept the lid on. I don't know if they knew nearly as much as Nixon and Eisenhower. And I'll backtrack something to I think is pretty important. I looked up what kind of treaty Eisenhower may have formed with his visitors in 54. And in my search engine, it came back 10-year agreement. And I couldn't find anything on this. And I thought, 10-year agreement? Where did they come to that? So I looked it up, and Lyndon Johnson got on the phone to President Eisenhower in his retirement and talked to him on February 19th, 1964, the exact 10-year anniversary. And then he hopped on a plane, flew all the way out to Palm Springs, and met with Ike in public and in private a couple of times, of all the places he could go at the end of what would have been this 10-year agreement. So what would Nixon be doing on the 19th anniversary of it in February 19th, 1973? Was he already going to go to this airbase to attend to this agreement in some manner? And I looked it up in his records. What did he do in February of 1974? And it's amazing how records were not kept. Very unlike the rest of Nixon's records. His February 74 visit to Key Biscayne was not recorded, only a couple phone calls, and information was not included, and documents have been lifted from this file. So we can't tell what happened on the 20th anniversary of the Eisenhower event. Very suspicious. I didn't see anything else like this in the Nixon records. So something's being covered up here, and what he was doing in Florida 1 year after the Gleason event at an airbase. And I put in my book a top 10 list of all the things that compare favorably that Eisenhower did in 54 that Nixon did, taking a helicopter, going at night, going to an airbase, attending to extraterrestrial matters, coming back, keeping your mouth shut, etc. I feel there's far too much here in common for it to be a coincidence.
One allegation that I have a continuing issue with, and it's me that has this issue, but I just don't believe, or I've never been able to accept that a treaty was made with them, in that they didn't and they don't have to make treaties with anybody about anything. They can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah.
And for me, that premise of a treaty separate from these other issues surrounding these very serious points is one I really have to reject. But again, that's me.
Yeah.
Do you feel that in the same spirit that President Reagan, who, whatever anybody feels about his politics, you've only got to scratch the surface of his involvement with the UFO subject to realize, number one, he took it extremely seriously, and number two, he had good reason to. His very well publicized personal sighting, along with his entire staff on board the governor's plane when he was governor of California, were tracked by a fully articulated disc for some period of time, and there was no effort to classify it. In fact, there's a very memorable interview with his pilot of the plane, where he is making it very clear that this was truly anomalous and disc-shaped, etc. Reagan seemed quietly obsessed to some of us with wanting history to know that he knew. But of course, you can't just say that. Maybe he has, a memoir to be published 50 years after his death or whatever, or there are other works like that by well-known people who can't speak when they're alive on this subject. But one's thoughts go to his poignant and very provocative remarks before the United Nations. I think
Hello, hello. Are we having a technical difficulty? I do not.
Yeah, we still got you, Paul. I think Peter's froze. There we go. I think he's
unfreeze. Yeah, there he is.
Yeah. I wonder if you feel, Paul, that either Nixon or Eisenhower, and this would be purely intuitive, and I'm just relying on your depth of involvement in the story, that either of them may have written out or recorded in one way or another their thoughts, their feelings, their accounts of the seriousness and the reality of the truly anomalous UFO subject for the future, so to say.
Yeah, I have not seen that. It would be somewhat out of character, especially for Eisenhower. Took these kind of oaths and secrecy very, very seriously. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Reagan, because that just happens to be the subject of my next book that I've been researching. And that story of 74, I've been looking up in his records how this could have really have happened. The pilot said it happened. A reporter who spoke to Reagan not long thereafter said, Reagan told me the whole thing. And and the reporter said, I asked him, Mr. Reagan, do you believe in UFOs? And Reagan just kind of went blank and like, well, let's just say I'm an agnostic or something. He tried to backpedal a little bit. And you're right. As soon as he won re-election in 84, he suddenly started talking about this. He had no more races to run for. And so he would give speeches and talk about what if we were threatened by a higher power from above, another alien race, and he made references quite often to it. Yes. He even went to Roswell, New Mexico, and gave a campaign speech for, I think, Senator Harrison, right near the hangar where allegedly Roswell recoveries were made. Yes. He also came to my hometown of Cape Girardeau in 85 or 86, somewhere in there, 87 maybe. I'd have to look it up, but he was in the airfield not far where allegedly this crash in 41 occurred. So coincidences, or he seemed to be genuinely interested and knowledgeable. His daughter said that he talked about it a little bit, that he was into UFOs. So it's a fascinating subject. If I can find enough material, I'll put together a book and make it a trilogy of Republican presidents here. And, they're more conservative. So you may be listening and paying more attention when you hear a conservative president talking about this rather than maybe a liberal, more expansive in a worldview or something like that. So it's really exciting when you find out Reagan allegedly had a 74 sighting. Yes. And Lucille Ball said she went to a party in the 50s and he came in and said, yes, I've just seen a UFO. That's and right. He was all shook up and excited about it. So there may have been at least 2 sightings that would trigger this interest in him.
That's my understanding as well, Paul. Yeah. Well, good luck with this book in particular, and we'll look forward to speaking with you about it when it finishes. I think a lot of us, and right now with this impending, well, it's ongoing right now, but it may become a conflict beyond words, just a few days old now in the Middle East, reminds a lot of us that we need to study history, or, to paraphrase a number of people, we will repeat our errors. In the world of UFO studies, you and I seem to have settled into areas that involve focusing in on individuals and a time in post-war history to augment our points and thoughts, and hopefully add more impetus, gravitas, and proof to the general UFO subject. Now, of course, more compelling in the public imagination than at any time, in a rather healthy, serious way. Any thoughts from your point of view on the extraordinary change we've seen in the way that the media and, to a degree, elected officials deal with this subject right now, when things changed about 6 years ago and they've been changing since, in this change of climate and how it's affecting people's perceptions and readers of your books, for example?
Yeah, we're getting more and more American politicians to speak openly about this, their interests, what they're hearing from people they interview, and it's no longer quite as taboo or crazy to talk about this. I think programs like Ancient Aliens and Travel Channel shows have broken people in over the past decade to get used to this idea that we are being visited. It's all had an effect. People are now filming with their cameras UFOs, and they're going viral on the internet, and these strange sightings. And I know some things are faked and some things are mistakes, like drones or flares or something, but I find it difficult to believe all of it is. Also helpful was this 60 Minutes story about 3 or 4 years ago, and they interviewed people who were in the military, very serious about this. One person said, our pilots see these things every time they go out on like a training mission or an exercise or something, every time. An orb, a disc, an entire like formation of them or something. So that lends real credence and gets people's attention. And we just got to get our politicians to take it more seriously and expose this here in America and in other nations. I'd like to see, like England and France, open up the books and tell us what you know. It would be helpful if other nations could set a precedence that America would have to follow, instead of being the leader of clamping the lid down and saying, you don't need to know this.
England and France, in fact, have gone out of their way over the past 2 decades or so to declassify to a greater degree than we have. Of course, we are the masters of the cover-up here in the United States of America, and one can only imagine some of the battles going on behind the scenes. Even as things change, there are individuals whose lives have been dedicated to keeping these secrets. And it's as deeply embedded in the fabric of their lives and their sense of responsibility and destiny and history as it is for others of us to see this material come to light, be shared with the general public. At the same time, the idea of what now is referred to as disclosure with a capital D I don't think is a simple process at all. You can't just say we're not alone in the universe, and we've been visited since time immemorial, and we in the United States at the highest levels have not been telling you the truth about it. That's very touchy for certain individuals, for example, former presidents or the descendants of former presidents, because for that announcement to be made or that knowledge to become public, it would be understood that every single president since and including Harry S. Truman have been unindicted co-conspirators in the biggest cover-up in human history. And whether or not they're progressive or conservative, Democrat, independent, Republican, or what have you, that's a very elite little club that really would not welcome that kind of intrusion. At the same time, it may be coming anyway. Your thoughts on the ongoing process we call disclosure?
It's difficult to say how much presidents know. Sometimes I think they know plenty and they're just plain dumb. They'll go on Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, and Jimmy Fallon talk shows, and they'll get asked, this host, God bless them, they ask right up front, are we being visited or not? Or what can you tell us about this? And Obama, Bush, Clinton, they all kind of give a flippant answer. They won't give a straight answer. I think Obama one time said it's a matter of national security, which, tells you right there, it's something very serious that they can't discuss. So it really is going on. If there was absolutely nothing to it, they'd say, that's a load of junk. We're not being visited. They never say that. And even Carter had his own UFO sighting and filled out a form in 74 about it. Yeah. And said during his campaign, if I become president, I'll make all the UFO files open because I've seen a UFO. And then once he got in office, he clammed up pretty quick. And he kind of backpedaled thereafter when he was asked about this UFO he saw. He doesn't want to give a straight answer. So they get to them and they read files. And I think they're kind of sworn to keep this under wraps. There's supposedly a CIA man named John Ramirez here in America who has said the American government, from what I understand, wants to keep the clamped lid tight on this for another 4 years, that in the year 2027, something will be taking place to reveal it or open it up, or we're going to learn more. Something's going to happen. And I did a podcast last night and the host said, I've heard that too, and from other people besides John Ramirez. So I don't know about that. I'd like to hear more. If you've got some information, what is it that is going to happen in 2027? And why do we have to keep the lid soldered shut for another 4 years?
Well, I will say personally, from the beginning of my obsessive originally involvement in the subject, starting in the later 1970s, every time a piece of information has emerged like that, or an alleged piece of information that something is coming, and it's going to be at about this time or in this year or on this date, it absolutely has never come to pass, not once. Yeah. So for me, 2027 is 1,000 years from now. We could be buying ice cream from Martians, next month. We just don't know whether or not this will go on for decades of kabuki dancing around and doing their best to drag their feet, or the story will bust open, in 3 months from now. It's, needless to say, a very interesting time to be involved in the field that we are. But I sometimes wonder to what degree those other intelligences, and I have felt for an awfully long time that we are logically dealing with a variety of them, a myriad, who may have intentions and relationships with the human race and with this planet that we can only imagine. Their relationship with this planet may predate our existence on Earth, and that they at a certain point may decide to not exercise what in Star Trek was called the prime directive of never show a less advanced civilization all of your technological wizardry, or they will literally have a meltdown, which I think is probably fairly accurate. That one wonders sometimes if at a certain point after however many years, depending on how far back we want to take this story, before 1947, one group of them may just say, screw it.
Yeah.
Here
we are. Yeah.
Pretty much. Exactly. Yeah. I don't see that around the corner, but crazier things have happened. We just don't know.
Yeah, there was an engineer named Don Phillips who worked for Skunk Works, and he used to work with like Lockheed and out in the California area. And he said, I was shown a file that was necessary for our technology we're working on that said Eisenhower met with extraterrestrials. And during the course of their conversation, he said in this file, it said Eisenhower talked to the humanoids from another planet and said, you're so advanced, how can we stop you? He just blurted it right out. We're pretty helpless and we're kind of at your mercy. So whatever agreement, formal or not, to keep at an arm's length and not set off a panic or show yourself, That could be broken by any race if you make an agreement with one. What about like 10 others that are coming here? The aliens that Gleason saw do not match at all with the aliens from Cape Girardeau 1941, from Roswell, or from the Eisenhower encounter. So there's probably, I've read and heard a few different sources say there might be up to a dozen here, different intelligences with different agendas and what they're doing and how friendly are they. So it's a real can of worms that you could be opening up. And the American people might lump them all together that, all aliens are alike. And, that probably isn't true. All human beings are not alike. Some are friendly, some are not very friendly.
Got that right. As we come into our last 5 minutes or so of the show, what would you advise or suggest to viewers and listeners who are really beginning to become involved in UFO-related studies? More and more people, needless to say, these days, care less and less what other people think about what they think about the subject. We live in a much healthier climate than we did even a few short years ago about that. How would you generally advise folks who are wanting to learn more, but not sure of sources to go to begin to better educate themselves about the seriousness and the implications of truly anomalous UFOs?
We could almost look to Jackie Gleason, who used to call up a late night show called the Long John Nebel Show in New York City because he was insomniac, and he talked about UFOs, but he made it clear he didn't believe everything he heard, and he wanted to do a lot of research, as we discussed earlier on the show. And that's what I would tell people to this day. Don't believe everything you hear. Do your own research. Look up plenty. Read, watch documentaries. Think for yourself. And study those videos that are online that go viral. And we do have to keep in mind videos can be faked. And there are lots of drones flying around, and there are flares and mistaken identities, innocent. And there are deliberate falsehoods for somebody trying to fool people. I really get annoyed by them. I mean, what's the point of making this phony video? You see them, people have like pro video shop, whatever they call it.
Logo.
There you go. And they can create their own stuff, and it's so maddening. Artificial intelligence is really going to throw us for a curve because you can program things in that simply are not so. It's kind of frightening, and it could stick a real monkey wrench into the UFO business as more and more people decide I'm going to create my own alien landing and claim it's an authentic video. And, muddy up the waters even worse. So do plenty of research and be somewhat cynical. I come from a cynical family. I don't believe everything I hear. And I try to eliminate all the junk and the wild conspiracy theories and not include them in my books. So I would urge people to obviously read my books, buy hundreds of copies of them, but also read other intelligent books that are well researched and have sources and resources and and notations and such, and come to your own conclusions.
Paul, do you have a website where people can learn more about your work?
Yes, but it's kind of crummy. I need to do more work on www.mo41.info. You can find me on 3 or 4 different Facebook pages, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest. If you've got a real life, genuine nonfiction story to tell on one of these tales that I've researched, I'd be happy to read your material, and I'll get in touch with you if you get in touch with me.
Paul, I know this is the time of year that the conference season starts to wind down to a degree, but where can people actually see you or meet you next?
I literally don't have any idea. I've been hunkered down writing a screenplay lately to get the Eisenhower and Nixon stories together in one Hollywood type of production. My agent will see if she can shop that, if we can get some interest. I understand through her recently Disney has bought the rights to a 1969, I think, England UFO crash. Was that Berwyn? Was that 69 or something like that? And that Disney is very interested in this sort of thing. UFOs are hot right now. Yes, so maybe we'll see my material go more for TV documentary or docuseries or through a film. But it's all kind of up in the air. Yeah. I have a book here, my first hardback book. It's on the Cape Girardeau UFO crash with new information in it. But my publisher was in ill health, and I haven't heard from him in a month, and I'm really worried if this thing's going to come out. So that would have been something else you could have looked for me for, but I'm not sure now. So I'll continue to work on my Ronald Reagan book and my Ruth Montgomery book, and maybe we'll do some more shows in the future.
Yes, keep me appraised, and of course, sending very best wishes to your publisher on their health issues. Otherwise, Paul, thank you so much for a really interesting conversation here, and for giving us an opportunity to come into your world. And I think as far as a screen treatment, however it might turn out, combining these two stories back to back just makes so much sense, because they do dovetail into each other perfectly. And it's certainly the only instance we have that we're aware of in American history of a president, vice president kind of passing along, getting very caught up in this story in their own ways and how it's manifested. That could be quite a film or a documentary series, or however. Again, visit Paul's website. Well, don't visit his website, but follow him on Facebook or become a friend, as I am, and you can keep in touch with him and follow what he's doing there. Paul, a great week to you. Thanks so much for being with us. This is Peter Robbins. My special guest tonight has been Paul Blake Smith, and the show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, and we will be back same time, same station next week. See you then.